I'm Woo Young Chung, track producer for this track B. I'm delighted that you decide to join us for this section. The, the data governance has been a critical topic for chief data officer since the beginning. And today's session, our distinguished speaker will discuss data governance and data intelligence. Now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Blake.
Great. Thanks, Woo Young, and welcome everyone. Thank you for attending the session today. Just to introduce, myself to kick off the discussion and what we're going to talk about. I am the Chief Strategy Officer for a company called OneTrust, and OneTrust is an organization that helps companies manage their governance of what they do as an organization to ultimately build trust in their business and with their consumers that are consuming the products and services that they build. Today, I am going to walk through a little bit of the path and journey that many of us are probably on of how do we build that data intelligence into our organizations, and what are some of the recent challenges that are being fostered and driven off of kind of I'll say just an insurgence of volatility in things like data protection laws and regulations that are putting all organizations a bit on their heels of getting their arms around data governance. And what does that journey look like? What are some of the key steps that you need to start thinking about putting in place to bridge that gap and actually empower your organization to better understand the data you have and put it to work for you? So we're going to go through that in a couple of different steps. Now, to start out, I want to talk about what is new and unique for many of us in terms of today's landscape of data, where it's coming from, and the kind of scale of the problem that we're talking about. As we all know, data is not a single place that exists in the organization anymore. We have tons of different applications that power the business, and that is driving a whole new tier of complexity in terms of how you think about basic governance of that data and use of that data. First off, what data do we have? What's available? Well, we have data across business applications that are SaaS-based, that are procured often in a decentralized way in organizations today. Data is being captured and processed and transformed in different data lakes. You have data that are going to different third parties. So the environment, purely from even just the storage and where it resides and where it's sourced and created and where it's going, that is a complex animal today. We have new challenges that are created because of the verboseness of the amount of data that we have. So we have huge data sets. We have data that is hidden that we don't even know we have. We have to think about the quality and the toxicity of data, not just from a is the data, okay in terms of quality and, when it was updated, but also, is it clean? Are we able to use it for what we intend to use it for? Is it okay to use it? And there's lots of interesting privacy and ethical things you have to take into consideration today that can actually cause a lot of harm if they're not properly governed and managed. So these are important topics to think about in terms of challenges. And then, what's at stake and risk? Well, a lot. You have data that is moving. You've got use of the data, which could introduce complex requirements or violations of things that you didn't realize. And of course, turning on something like, here's an automation tool that we found and we plugged it into our CRM, all the work and effort that you traditionally have done to protect the CRM and the CRM data, you may have just created a massive backdoor to allow something like a breach, whether it's a breach of contract, like adding a new sub-processor for moving that data to, transferring that data outside of a country boundary can be a violation of a contract today, as well as things like just security data breach of, you move data over here, and yes, you've, Fort Knox structured the protection of the data where you think it is, but now you've created copies and backdoors of getting access to that data. So it creates lots of new problems. So new risk, different stakeholders, lots of things you have to consider before you can even get to the point of saying, how do we even use the data? But you also have an expansion of the stakeholders and different personas of individuals in the companies that want to use this data. And this is important, and I'll table it for a moment, but just want to put this thought in the back of everyone's head. You have lots of people that want to use data for their own creative ways in their own departments of the business. But what is changing in the landscape today is traditionally we have thought of what data do I have and can I empower the person to use it? And is it possible to use that data? To use of data today has to be coupled with the notion of what's the purpose. So why am I using that data, or how am I using the data? Not just do I have the data or not. And that's important because that context defines if it's okay to use the data or not use the data, or if you can use it in certain ways. Like it's okay to use if it's anonymized, it's okay to use if certain information is masked. Those types of things become important to your ability to even use it. So understanding the same set of data you can use for, let's say, customer operations processes that you do, but you can't use that for tailored outreaches that your sales and marketing team wants to use. So that purpose becomes really key. So I just want to plant that seed in the back of everyone's head as we think about going forward. Now, one of the core things that is starting to build up in the marketplace is this notion of, we want to use this. We've got all these great ideas. I've got ML projects I want to use data for. I've got efficiency projects, customer success projects, multiple things that are driving those uses. But almost at a counter to trying to use the data is the notion of compliance. How do I comply to the laws, the regulations, the frameworks, the policies? And you know, that balance almost kind of is like a composing force. What is transforming and changing today is we're starting to see the uniformity around those two disciplines in an organization. It's not the data scientist and the data stewards against the compliance and governance individuals. It's how do we put compliance and governance ruling and framework in place that gives us actually the guardrails and the processes and technology to be able to use the data faster, more confidently, because we understand what's okay and not okay to do. We've got clear guidelines instead of lots of ambiguity of, oh, talk to legal, talk to privacy, talk to compliance, you know, all this stuff that's very ad hoc, unstructured, unrefined, unoptimized processes. If you unify those things together, you can actually create better efficiencies, which gives your organizations the empowerment and the confidence of using their data for all those great business value initiatives that they want to achieve. So balancing those scales is what you're going to see really start to happen. And there's some unique things that are happening on the technology landscape to really help accelerate your ability to do that. And I'll talk about that as I go through what this looks like. So how do you get to a notion of actually understanding the data you have and using it in an intelligent way? Well, we kind of like to say there's 4 big steps you go on in that journey. Step 1 is, first you need to understand what data you have. Where is it at, and how do you organize and classify it? The second step on that is, what are the governing policies you need to put around those different sets of data? And how do you get that structured and unified in a well-orchestrated engine that allows your teams to understand those policies and still use the data while complying to those guidelines and guardrails? So governing the use of the data, putting the measures in place, and so forth. Then it becomes using it, understanding your use of it, understanding where you're not using it that you could. And then once you've mastered that, you start to go down the path of, well, how do we get more? How do we actually capture more data, improve the quality of data that we have, expand the use of the data? Because sometimes, you know, getting more data or using data for new things is an exercise of getting the authorization or approval to use it for a new purpose of processing, as we would say. So improving that is one of the key steps in that journey. So I'm going to go through these in detail to walk through some of the pragmatic things to think about and some of the key technologies, if you will, that are help empowering organizations to do each of these steps. So first step is know your data. To break this stage up into just a few subcomponents. The first thing you need to understand is, of course, discovering and classifying what you have. Many organizations were built over decades of time, and they often do not know what they even have and what actually exists there. So the first step in that process is to point to, if you will, your systems of information and curate and crawl and index and figure out what do you actually have that is available for you to use. Now, sometimes this is a broader, data pipeline exercise of moving data to data lakes, data warehouses, data storage type systems. In some cases, it's just tooling to kind of connect into the respective systems and actually do the discovery and crawling. And traditionally to create, now the output of all this is now I have a catalog of all of my data. And traditionally, the way organizations have built those catalogs has been through metadata only modeling. Now, the challenge with that is a couple things. One, the process to do metadata management to create catalogs to start that governance process typically is pretty ad hoc of a process. It's not embedded in real time and kind of discovering, if you will, on an ongoing basis. It's sort of, let's take a snapshot of the architecture structure of the data and let's look at the metadata and pull that back in. So the frequency of doing it is not as ideal, especially when we live in a world where we're spinning up new apps and services, we're adding new types of data being captured, we're storing new things, we're doing more agile projects, all those types of things. You have to have something that kind of keeps up with the pulse of the business and is much more integrated. Second couple of big problems you have here are tied to metadata really only scratches the surface of what's actually in the system. As you can imagine, metadata from an underlying, let's just think of a relational database, pretty simple example. Getting the information back about the column name of what data is stored in a actual column in a database and the table name probably isn't as descriptive as it should be or could be, or doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually what's being stored in that information. So many of these kind of processes and techniques that organizations have historically relied on just fundamentally fall apart when you start thinking about, well, the field that someone put in our CRM system is custom variable 7. Well, that field name doesn't tell me a lot about what's actually being put in there. Going through and actually sampling the raw data and doing the discovery of what is actually stored there helps me understand at a much more accurate level the context of that information and what's really behind the data that's in that system. So jumping into a discovery level is really, really key to understand the data. And why that's important is as you look at the governing aspects, the landscape of what is governed has kind of gone from, a few industries being governed and regulated and a few sets of data, PCI data. Okay, are we storing credit cards? Yes or no? HIPAA data. Do we have patient care information that's kind of sensitive? And maybe, financial type data that's very sensitive. That has now moved to a world where it's not just those 3 or 4 very deterministic classifiers that are considered needing governance. It is a world now where you have regulations like data protection regulations like GDPR, CCPA. You have broad context statements like personal data, the sale of data. You have ethics and conscious, biased algorithm concern type things where you need to infer, is there religion inside of this column of data in the data set? So being able to actually look and see, well, someone has put, a sentence or a paragraph of information, and I can infer religion based on that. That type of discovery is very difficult to do purely looking at only the metadata. So diving in deeper is really key. And diving in deeper is a complex problem. It means that you have to look at, structured data sets. You have to look at unstructured and even semi-structured data sets. In some cases, especially for unstructured, as you can imagine, you need to leverage technologies like vision recognition to look at, for example, let's say, a screenshot of a passport that is inside an Excel document that's stored in an S3 bucket. Being able to see that level of information and to classify what's actually happening there is really, really key to understand what you actually have and what type of governance needs to be applied to it. So discovery, classification, automating that process is step one in terms of understanding your data. Step two, once you've understand kind of the bolts of what information is there, the technical bytes of that data set and the derived metadata from that actual data, you then need to think about, well, what is the business context? What is the business terminology? We always talk about data literacy when we talk about the intelligence of the business and understanding the data. So to apply that literacy, we need to overlay across what we've discovered with the taxonomy of the business, the terminology we use. And then that intersection gives us life to understand what's customer data, what's payment data, what's all this information. So just to dive into a little more detail of that, for example, to understand both the business terminology as well as the regulatory compliance that drives governance, you need to understand what is employee data, because there's certain laws and regulations that govern employees or prospective employees, and you have to comply to those very specifically with how you're using that data, how long you're storing it, what's in scope of a consumer rights request or an employee rights request. All that information is very unique and contextual to that. Who is a third party? What is considered personal health of the information? So that taxonomy of employee data, customer data, vendor data, customer records, sales data, marketing data, usage data, all that taxonomy is really key to kind of do that linking. And as I had kind of alluded to and described, there's a myriad of different complex regulatory environments. So understanding that intersection to go from here are the policies and excuse me, the laws and regulations and frameworks that maps to a set of data use policies, which kind of maps down to a level of what are the controls that we need to have in place on what's okay to do and what's not okay to do with the data. And then everything from, you know, how long can we keep it? How acceptable or how much governance needs to be around use of it, transfers of that data to third parties, all that type of information is sort of driven out of that. And then, of course, the next step in that process is you've got laws and regulations and effectively your policies that you can apply to your data sets. Now you need to enlighten your data and understand business context. What's this for? Things that you can't necessarily scan or discover. You've got to have people that ultimately own the data and understand the quality, the source, the end-to-end life cycle of the data. And this is where you integrate with your human force, your team of individuals that start to curate and enlighten that data. So business owners, technical owners, and data stewardess that can start to enlighten and empower even more metadata around that catalog that you're building. The next stage is to think about data quality. So once you understand the data, you want to understand, well, what's the quality? And quality is important because it helps you understand what is it good to use for. So, what makes up data quality? Let's start with this first, pillar here on the left, which is completeness. Do I have all the data that I need to achieve or do what I'm trying to do? So really simple example we can all relate to. If I'm trying to physically ship you something, I need to know your street address, your city, your state, if you're in the United States here, your postal code. If I don't have that and I don't have good quality of that, it's hard for me to use it for that purpose. So completeness of the data set is one element to think about and consider, which can derive helping educate your organization on if it's a good use of that purpose of the data. Consistency, as you can all imagine, the discrepancies across the data sets and the aspects of that, looking at quality. Timeliness, is this still effective and accurate? When was that data collected? Is that information available? Is it still relevant for the context of when it was given? You could think of lots of examples where having data from 5 or 6 years ago may no longer be relevant. Uniqueness of that information. So is this the only instance of that data? Do we have duplicate sets of this information in the organization? Which one is the master set or the most relevant of that? And then, of course, validity in terms of, what it was collected for. And this is an important concept, especially when you go to think about using that data, that you have to take into consideration, which is data is, you always want to think about data was collected for a specific purpose, and you can use it for that purpose. But if you want to use it for another purpose, you need to think about, am I changing materially the scope of what that data was intended to use for? So the simple example of that is, if I captured this information to provide fraud prevention services, and I am expanding my capabilities of fraud prevention, and maybe adding that to a level of security enlightenment to the system, arguably that probably is still within the spirit of the reason that data was given to you as an organization. If you want to now use that same data, though, to retarget and do personalized advertising, just to give an example, that may have crossed a barrier where now you are processing the data for what the world would deem a different purpose. You're using it for a new purpose, and that may violate multiple human right, data protection right policies in the world that you need to be aware of before you just do that. You may have certain transparency notices. You may have certain opt-out notices that you have to provide to be able to use the data for that purpose, as well as even pre-capture things like reconsent to allow you to do that for that purpose. And it could be a new purpose. It could be sharing it with a new third party to allow your users to have those choices. So quality, a key thing there. And of course, the outcome, I had mentioned this before, was to centralize all this information into a catalog that allows you to govern the use of that data across the business. And most of the time when you talk about governance, you talk about risk management, governance of the data, and seeing what data you have so you can identify and reduce risk. And what we found is that it's really difficult to achieve understanding and governing your data when you're doing it in silos across different departments in the organization. If your data scientist team have a catalog of what data they have and they're using it to shop for data and find data, but they're using a different tool and they're storing that information differently than what your GRC and compliance team is doing, that has to deal with, maybe rolls up to your chief compliance officer, has to deal with certain sanctions and government or regulatory compliance, which might be different than your privacy team that maybe deals with ethical issues of use of data or privacy issues of use of data. And if everybody's doing that independently, you're probably slowing down the ability for you to actually do anything with the data, because you're having to go to different teams and get sign off and deal with different policies and things like that. So having a central catalog that sort of unifies these work streams gives your organization a whole new level of efficiency, because you can operationalize multiple points of data and workflow together. So building a central repository of all your data assets, having the context of the business purpose process of what business group is processing and using this data, what does that mean in terms of the relationship between the technical metadata and the business metadata is really, really key. Relationships that derive the flow of information can help you understand where you have maybe certain contractual clauses that have to be in place to manage or use the data, as well as, of course, centralizing the business glossary or the terminology, the literacy of what these terms mean, and of course, defining the data policies and regulatory scope, which might include things like retention policy or the age of the data. So holistically, that is how you centralize the view of understanding that data together. One of the ways that we as an organization, OneTrust builds a technology tool set that helps you basically govern and understand your data to comply to regulations like GDPR, but also to empower the business to self-service, requesting, using data, and seeing data that they have to do that. So we have a suite of technologies that basically allow you to discover the data. We sample and look at the raw data itself, so it makes it really easy for us to get accurate representation of what information is actually there. Curate and manage the metadata, apply the business taxonomy, terminology, the context of using it, generate automatically things like your records of processing activities that have to go to data protection regulator authorities, automate the process of taking that discovered data and fulfilling things like consumer rights requests. For those of you who are in the States, you may have heard of the term CCPA in California, which is getting updated to CPRA. And then you have the state of Colorado, the state of Virginia, and a couple other states pending that have similar data protection laws or rights for their consumers, where you basically have to comply to stop processing their data, stop selling their data, and or deleting their data. So whatever that means for you based on your industry, that can mean that you have to have very tight tooling and integration into helping you understand what you can and can't use that data for, and having workflow and orchestration processes in place to help you use the data. But obviously, if you need to provide choice and transparency to use that data, fulfilling that right or request so you can enable that type of service. And then, of course, governing, mapping your policies to what you can use the data for. This becomes really interesting and dynamic because you start to take processes like requesting access to use the data and dynamically applying integrations into, let's just say, something like a Snowflake, where we dynamically may mask certain data fields based on the purpose or the use case that you are using that data for. So if certain information is discovered, it's classified and tagged a certain way from your governance teams, that's fine. We're not going to rip the data away from you, but something like, let's say, a date of birth might get masked dynamically. And when you go to access that data for your application, you only get the month and the year, not the exact date, for example, to help comply to certain privacy obligations that the team may have seen as part of the governance policy. And then, of course, embedded in a little bit of what I just said, but the self-servicing aspect is also something pretty key and critical here to enable you to be able to have business stakeholders look and shop for, if you will, and find and discover the data that is in the system and environment, and request access and kicking off integrated workflows that can automatically have your privacy team conduct a PIA on that new use of data or that new type of data. Have your compliance team or ethics team sign off on a workflow that captures the ethical reviews or ethical frameworks to implement, ethics by design processes embedded into your AI or ML use of that data set. Those types of workflows and compliance processes can start to become automated actions, which again, streamline what you need to do as an individual and an organization to use the data, and create all the record keeping to ensure that you're compliant and you're able to demonstrate that compliance to the business and users. So that's a quick broad stroke and overview of everything that you can do to start to better understand your data and become much more intelligent about how you use that data, how you can govern it, and ultimately consume more of it as a business. So for those of you who are interested in additional details about maybe a solution that can help you with some of these things, encourage you to navigate to some of the resources that we have on our OneTrust website. And if you'd like to set up kind of time to see a live product demonstration, you can do that there on our website with the link provided as well. So with that, I am going to turn this back over to, I think we've got time for some Q&A questions. Woo Young, is that correct? It looks like we've got a few questions coming in. If you do have any questions as I'm going through and reading some of these, feel free to just chat those in and I'll answer what I can get to here. So one of the questions, this is really interesting. So one of the questions that has come in here is, how do you manage the issue of combining data sets that ultimately create a new risk? Metadata may or may not surface in as a potential, data set. So this is spot on. It is a huge risk because anytime you join data, you almost create new data, and you create new metadata based on that joining of the two data. So this is where going back to my statement on your use of the data is tied to a purpose. And that net set of what data you're using in a silo might not be a problem, but in a aggregate or a combination, it could become a problem. Something that could have been unidentifiable and perfectly fine to use, all of a sudden created a compliance problem or a privacy problem. So being embedded into the process of how you're using the data or making those requests to use this data and this data combined um, does create a new challenge and does create a opportunity to further embed compliance workflows into those type of, let's just say, agile CI/CD continuous integration development environments. For those of you who are not familiar with the acronym, but continuous integration type environments where you're exploring, you're kind of seeing what you can do, and you want kind of quick feedback on, is it okay to do this? You know, if I do this and this and combine these together, here's the net set of that information. So does that in itself create a problem? And that's I think, you know, one true a new risk. This is also a new frontier for, I think, the world to figure out. And there's also some interesting technologies that are emerging that allow you to do things like dynamic policy injection, dynamic query manipulation and modification, where the joining of those two data sets can dynamically trigger a policy which could automate the process of saying, well, column 1 and 2, which normally would come back in the raw form, are going to come back anonymized. They're going to come back masked. And I think you're going to see an increasing investment from a lot of the data platforms in those areas as the world kind of matures and we do more of those things. Similarly, other technologies that are starting to emerge are things like blind data joins, where you have an opportunity to use data for some purpose, but you need some augmented additional data. And let's just say you don't necessarily own that data, or that data is provided within a different department or business unit in your company, and you don't necessarily want to give access to those data sets to a single party, you know, for the same reason. It creates a new privacy risk. So doing what are called blind joins allow you to effectively allow the system to compute the data, and you get the result out of it without you getting the actual raw information, which could create, again, lots of interesting problems. So I see those types of technologies continuing to foster as people go to use data for this. These types of compliance and regulatory things are going to drive those types of technologies coming together. Other question here, great slides. Can we get a copy of these? I think the short and simple is yes, absolutely. We will get that distributed. What strategy do you recommend to bring self-service to the largest number of areas in an organization? Is it enough with tools and training? You know, I think this is one where once you think you've done it, you've just gotten started. I think it is one of those rinse and repeat, and you have to say it 7 times to get people on board. One of the key things we're very focused on as an organization is the notion of compliance has to intrinsically be built into what you're actually doing. So rather than thinking of it as a bolt-on technology or a bolt-on process after the fact, you have to build a culture of awareness. You have to build a technology tooling system that is integrated, that enables those types of things to become just, you know, part of your subconscious. You're just doing them as you're trying to do work, and it just becomes a natural thought of individuals. And you have to be key to build these in a way so that it doesn't slow your organization down. So for example, investing in, one of the things we commonly do for organizations is as part of their developer pipeline that build applications, you know, every build, for those of you who are in software and development, every build, you typically do things like a static code analysis, or you're running automation checks on your software code to ensure the integrity and quality of the code. Very similar to that process, when you do a build of an application, you can run these data discovery platforms to discover, did we just create 12 new columns in the database. And in those 12 columns, what are they intended for? And if I can intersect capturing the why, where did we get this information? What are we storing it for? Are there any ethical, compliance, privacy requirements that we need those engineers to be aware of as part of that process? That quick feedback loop enables the organization to embrace it, and enables a level of self-servicing. So it's not somebody having to ad hocly think to go to some website or form or application to go fill something out or do something. It just becomes embedded into the day-to-day work. So I think starting with the notion of awareness and training, rinse and repeating that multiple times, but also being very intentional that you need to be building these types of things into the day-to-day systems and applications that you're using. Another simple one is things like procurement processes for vendors, embedding directly into whether it's the procurement tool, the quote process, the CRM that's using that, embedding things like vendor risk reviews or data transfer analysis type processes into that. And there's ways to do that with the software that is available today. One specific question that came in: how deep is the application of OneTrust in clinical data? I would say pretty deep. Many of our customers are clinical data research or medical research institutions that have very sensitive and lots of unique and very ever-changing sets of data. And why that's interesting or important is there's a lot of scrutiny on the use of that data. Who gets access? How long do we have it for? How do we store it? Those types of things. So the ethical, compliant use of that data based on where those patients live in the world is just a rat nest, if you will, of different policies you have to be aware of. So being aware of it and then actually implementing it is really, really key. So definitely something to take into consideration there. Does OneTrust provide, a question came in, does OneTrust provide the capabilities of traditional data cataloging tools such as Calibra, Elation, et cetera? The short answer is yes. We all come to the market from different aspects of the journey of how we got here. We all have, catalogs of data and information. Some have different capabilities than others. Some are more automated than others in different lights and aspects. But in short, yes, we provide a catalog of here's all the data that I have as an organization and help you understand the relationship of it, as well as, like I said, the policies of it and how that comes into place. One question: what special considerations need to be taken into account for real-time? I assume this is real-time changes in data. Really a lot, and it varies depending on the volume of data that you're talking about for real-time. Understanding what data is in this system that has this massive data storage engine behind it, and it's processing a ton of requests every single day at a very large scale. I don't need to sample every transaction and byte that comes through the networking pipes. I can sample a subset of that information, 1%, 2% of that information, and still understand, okay, the types of data that are actually being stored here are these types of data, and they need to be governed under these policies. So sampling is a really key, unique technique that's commonly used just to give you efficiencies and scale. In general, you are typically, you always like to think about event-based, real-time sort of, streaming type-based integrations, as well as just scheduled and periodic scans of information. So if I've got data at rest sitting somewhere, maybe I want to scan and analyze that on a certain schedule or frequency. I just want to say every month I want to analyze this data set, and maybe even within that I'm doing some sampling, so it doesn't take forever to do that. When I have streaming of information coming through, I might want to again pull every 1 out of 10 packets off the network, if you will, or look at 1 out of 10 data sets and kind of capture the information based on that to do it a little more real time. It depends on how frequent you're changing your applications or how frequent you're changing maybe your processes. One of the most relevant and I think interesting and desirable ways is more event-based. And event-based is things like when you do, let's say, change control process and approval to your CRM system, where maybe you've added new fields of data that you're capturing, have that event kick off the system doing a rescan, if you will, a reanalysis of the system to capture the diff or the delta. When you are doing a new build of the application, when you push a new mobile application out, have that event of we are publishing a new mobile application, kick off the scan and analysis of that mobile application to see, wow, the creative engineer, turned on this new setting, and now this new SDK has been embedded into the application, and it's now capturing this additional data. And we need to, A, make sure we wanted to do that, but B, let's go update our data catalog and make sure the other parties that may want to use that information are aware of the type of data that we have and the type of processing and purposes that we can use it for. So event-based is another great way to think about how do you take that into consideration and embed it into many of your processes. All great questions. And I think I covered the bulk of them. So with that, you can feel free to chat anything else. We're happy to respond offline as we get to that. Woo-Young, I will turn it back over to you. I want to thank everyone again for your time and the attention here and the discussion that we had. Again, if there is any follow-up or additional insights you'd like to learn about what we are doing to help organizations actually use more data, understand it better, and govern the use of it so you don't make mistakes with what you're using it for, again, onetrust.com, and we'd be happy to follow up with you. So Woo-Young, thank you for having us, and I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for your very thoughtful, thought-provoking presentation. And also, I'd like to thank everyone who attended this symposium. This session. And just a short programming note, the next session will begin at 3:30 p.m. So you have about 30 minutes to take a break and get a cup of coffee and so on. I will see you at 3:30 p.m. Thank you.